Hi, Maya.
Hi, Alex. Wait,
How's it going?
where are you?
I live in San Francisco.
Oh, I thought so. Somebody else contacted me about Plato recently, so
Oh, really?
I've gotten you two confused because not that many people reach out to me about this topic anymore.
This is what comes of talking to Earl Fontenot.
Oh, okay. So you know Earl, got it. So you listen to the podcast.
I listened to the podcast. And at some point, I wasn't familiar with your work beforehand, or oh my God, I had COVID last week, so my brain is still quite mushy. Or with the work of your mentor, your classics mentor.
John,
Whose name I forget. What's that?
about John Bremer.
Yeah, John Bremer. But I had written a long essay about like structural features of the Protagoras at one point,
Okay.
and was always very interested in that stuff. So when I heard the episode you did of the Schwepp with Earl, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense.
What's role analysis about?
Of the Protagoras.
Yeah.
Um, uh, so the Protagoras ends where it begins. So it's got this looping structure.
Yeah.
And at the center of the Protagoras is the question of like, is virtue teachable? And there's a
Yeah.
bunch of criticism in there about writing as a form. So I was interested in the way that Plato addresses his own critique about writing,
Right.
creating this cyclical structure of rereading and stuff like that. Um,
Yeah, I know. And it goes through all the dialogues seem to have some feature of that somewhere.
yeah. Um,
I mean, one thing that always confused me and that I still don't really totally understand is how much of that was Plato and how much of that was just the chiastic, you know, form of the age. So I don't know that that's, still clear to me yet.
yeah. I mean, I think, what your work and John Bremer's work show is that there is like a precision and a deliberateness
Yeah,
is, I think goes beyond any
I
any
know.
ring cycles in Homer
Actually,
or
an obsession, like total radical crazy. I mean, I always was thinking about that, how insanely high level that is without any digital
mm,
backup. I mean, you
mm.
really do have to hold it all inside of your head and have help, and it's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Although, I think the material, like the arguments that you make about the material conditions of like, it's got a
That's
bunch of slaves and there are a bunch of like tablets that are
wax
all pretty much
tablets,
the same
probably.
size and you can move them around.
I think that's what it was, but I mean, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really compelling suggestion. Um,
Imagine seeing the Republic like that in a physical room, according to, I mean, it's just such a wild,
Not only seeing it like that, but like imbuing that structure with a deep
yeah,
metaphysical, mystical importance. It's pretty,
definitely.
it's pretty wild.
But so what's your work right now? Why were you, what were you doing? Just checking out forum arguments online, or what are you doing?
So this is like a little rabbit hole in this larger project that I'm doing.
Okay.
But I'd like to be able to say something interesting about it. I'm writing a book about the science and philosophy of the tradition of the transition from life to death,
Oh,
and possibly back again. Um,
that's
and
cool.
yeah, it's super fascinating, and it's like intellectually challenging. There's a bunch of fascinating neuroscience. Obviously, the philosophical arguments are sort of everywhere
Yeah.
and endless. So it's really rich. And at the core of the book is this question about near-death experiences, these like really profound journeys that people go on. often around the time, we don't know exactly when, but around the time that they go into cardiac arrest and are considered clinically dead. So that's been a scientific paradox and has also been used philosophically, to be like, this is proof of dualism. This is proof of the survival of personal identity after death. This is proof of,
Right.
afterworlds of various flavors. Um, and it's often said, although this is not true, that the myth of is like the first near-death experience reported in history. It's not the first, but I think it's incredibly compelling.
Significant, right.
What's that?
Very significant one.
Yeah, very significant. And, I think question about the development, if this is even right to use that word, between the Phaedo and the Republic. But like, so much of the Western philosophical discourse about the nature of death and the soul
Yeah.
is already present in the Phaedo, and you know, and to a certain extent in the Republic. So,
Hmm.
um, one the question that I am trying to address as a sort of side alley of my larger project is, what role does the myth of play in
Hmm.
the Republic, especially with regard to the arguments about the nature of the soul? Um, I mean, I think this is totally speculative, but even the allegory of the cave has so much of the structure of like a sort of typical or classic near-death
Yeah.
experience. Leaving the world of shadows to enter, like to approach this like bright light,
Yeah.
overwhelming light, which is also like
Right. God,
fundamentally good.
truth. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anyways, that was a long spiel, but
So
that's what.
is your book about the ancient world, or it's about this transition over historically, cultural, all across the board?
90% of the book is about the past 20 years,
Okay.
and 10% of the book is trying to put the
Okay.
20 years into the longue durée. Uh,
Hmm.
and,
Very interesting. That's a very interesting topic.
yeah, it's a really fascinating, and it's got, it's emotionally resonant
Yeah.
for most people.
Yeah. Okay. I would like to see it when it's done. But I mean, what do you think? What is your question about the myth of Earth? What do you think?
Um,
It is one of my favorite parts of the Platonic corpus, so I do have
oh,
thoughts.
right, I'm talking to the right person then.
Yeah, I think you are.
I mean, I guess my first question is like, talk me through how you think about the role it plays structurally. There are many people classical scholars who's like, this is an embarrassment. This is like, what do we do about this? Like, can we sweep this under a rug? Was this added later?
Yeah, yeah, right. Oh yeah, well there were plenty of questions about the integrity, with which the Republic was written. I feel like part of my structural argument really encouraged everybody to think about the wholeness of the text and to
Mm,
stop that whole discussion about, is it subpar, is a myth lesser than a so-called logical argument? Because if my structural argument is correct, it's clearly intentionally placed.
mm,
So obviously, if that's the case, it was very important to Plato, because here we are with this magnum opus that has all this argument and all this incredible amount of volume of, citations and quotations and poetic allusions and whatever. But still, what holds the real place of honor is
mm,
incredibly amorphous, weird myth.
mm,
So
mm,
why
mm.
would that be? Why would he care about it so much? So, I mean, this takes us back, I guess, to my conceptual view of the Republic, which does differ from the mainstream. I think a lot of people think, okay, it's a political book, or it's a demagogue, at work. It's censorship. It gets so much bad rap from those early chapters. But ultimately, my view, I'm almost nervous to say it at this point because it's been so criticized, I think, by a lot of people. But my view, and I mean, now I have a business that's built on my view, so there's something to it,
Mm,
is, about the evolution of the human soul. I don't think The Republic is a political book. I don't think it is a book about anything we should do in life or how democracy should be run. Like, of course, there's a layer of that, and that's the genius of Plato is, he's able to do a very layered commentary that appeals and also withholds a lot of things from a lot of people, depending
mm,
on what you're able to absorb from it, what you want from it. But ultimately, to me, it's a book about how we should live considering the kinds of souls that we have as humans. And what's really
mm,
interesting about the Platonic mind, is here we are, as you said, at this really incredible apogee of human evolution, like at this point of delimiting a new way of being human, in society, in community, in
mm,
democracy. So I think Plato was facing a question at that point of like, knowing that this is what we're signing up for, what should we do about that? And his
mm,
ultimate answer, is a very Eastern, spiritual, mystical answer. And of course, this is where I differ from 95% of my colleagues. The
mm,
answer is something like, I mean, I loathe to say it because it's so negatively viewed, but it's something like personal development or self-development or
mm,
introspection into this thing that we have, the Soul. And as I said, now I developed my company Soulsway, which is a hypnosis business
mm,
about that introspection into the Soul. Because
mm,
here we are, thousands of years later, still not doing that enterprise that Plato was so, extremely outspoken about how essential it was to our
mm,
joy. So, I mean, is it about the afterlife? Yeah, it's a myth about the afterlife because ultimately how you live is determined by what you think is going on here, so to speak.
mm,
If
mm,
you think that you're going to have to reckon with yourself and grow and evolve, then you might live your life differently than if you think, well, it's all meaningless, whatever. So that
mm,
myth is like a capsule moment to a whole other 9 books, which are asking this question over and over about how do you want to live? And of course,
mm,
his answer is we want to live in the life of philosophy. What does that mean to a regular person? It just means living the life of curiosity, living a life of inquiry. Philosophy,
mm,
again, is so misinterpreted by these, analysts. Like, oh, we have to do philosophy in the, you know, ivory tower way. I don't think that's what he was saying. What he was saying
mm,
was, you are human. You have a soul inside of you. What you expose your soul to will determine the quality of your joy and the quality of your contribution to
mm,
everything, including yourself. What do you want to do about that? And then his highlight to that is one day you're going to face yourself. It's very, Judeo-Christian. It's very,
mm,
simple in a way. One day you're going to turn around and have to face yourself and choose again. Are you going to know more, when you make that choice than you did this time? Or are you going to, squander it and repeat the same nonsense?
mm,
And that's what the myth kind of leaves you with is
mm,
this question of, well, when I get to choose again, will I be in a better position?
mm,
I mean, how else are you going to really be convincing after 9 books of heavy duty, pedagogical, mathematical, all of this heavy lifting philosophy? How else are you going to really convince the people?
mm, mm,
I do this in hypnosis all the time. I can talk through logical questions with people all day long, and it works very well, by the way. I do use a Socratic method, very much like what we read in the Republic. But at the end of the day, the subconscious is interested in this question of
mm,
when I get there, what's going to happen?
mm,
So
mm.
he covered all his bases. And as you said, I mean, I'll stop talking for a second because
No, no, go ahead.
soon as you let me start talking about the Republic, I can't stop. But as you said, the beauty of the Protagoras, the beauty of the Republic, I think the beauty of the whole corpus is
Mm,
that it's timeless.
mm,
The
mm,
whole thing is created in a vacuum, kind of, where it doesn't matter if you pick it up today or, I think probably in 1,000 years or when I did it 20 years ago, you know, those questions are existing as though in outer space. And that quality of circularity where he sends you back to the beginning over and over, you know, I just can't think of a more subconscious way to get people to actually do the job. You
mm,
get to the end, and what does it do? Well, it sends you back to the beginning. So now you have to actually do the thing. And once you've
mm,
done it once, what else is there to do but to review it and do it again? And so that's why the Republic is so brilliant. This story that's retold, you know, tomorrow about yesterday, today.
mm, mm, mm,
And it has this, infinitude to it.
mm,
it,
mm,
it is what it's telling you to do. It is the thing that it claims to. I mean, it's almost beyond, it's like ineffable in a way. You really have to like be intimate with it to get what I'm saying. But
mm,
like it is the challenge that it is
mm,
in
mm,
that structural presentation. And it
mm,
starts out right in the first word, yesterday.
mm, mm.
It's so smart. He already set it up to be, a cycle.
Yep, yep. Um,
And the,
so,
the implication, of course, is philosophy is cyclical. It's
mm,
iterative. There is no answer. I mean,
mm,
this is a huge issue that I have with, the majority of Plato's Platonic scholarship is we're still stuck in this idea that Plato is interested in forms and the truth and that they exist.
mm,
It's as though that's provable or findable. Like, come on, we've been doing this for fucking thousands of years now. It's ridiculous to claim that there's any endpoint. There isn't. There is a continual peeling back, there's
mm,
a continual discovery. And so that life of
mm.
philosophy is implied in the structure of the text, which is okay, repeat yourself.
Yeah,
Start
and if
start
you
again.
reconceive philosophy as a sort of therapia as opposed to
Exactly.
sort of
I'm not even having to
logical.
reconceive it. That's my original conception.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because that's Plato's conception. The only reason we need to reconceive it is because it's been diluted by analysis.
Mm, mm,
The analysts have taken away that magic from us, but that's implied. That is
mm,
the Platonic view. It's therapeutic.
mm, mm,
I mean, I'm glad you're bringing it up because sometimes I wonder why did I get this whole degree, to go on to this career, but you're really like reminding me like this is how I founded this idea. This is where it
mm.
came from.
I mean, and it's almost explicit in the Protagoras,
Yeah.
you know, that is the project that he's engaged in.
Agreed. And I mean, yeah, okay. I wanted to tie it into the Phaedo too, which is, you brought that up as the question of death. But I mean, really, that the question that has always been in my heart from that text is how do we speak to the little child inside of us who is so nervous and so afraid of what Plato called the boogeyman, called
Mm,
death? I think that's in that dialogue. I'm
mm,
99% sure I'm right. It's been a while since I've read them. But
mm,
the question there is again, that's a therapeutic question because, I sit here all day working with people and that's what they're afraid of. What am I, I'm afraid of death. I'm afraid I'm not gonna, you
mm,
know, be able to handle it. I'm afraid of losing my loved ones. All of this, typical human
mm, mm,
metaphysical concern. Well, Socrates wanted us to deal with it, right there in that dialogue.
mm, mm. Um, so do you see the myth of as serving like fundamentally a rhetorical purpose as the capstone of the Republic, or do you think, and I'm sure there are many, I don't mean to like rhetorical to me is not a reductive
No, I
term,
agree.
but or do you think he also thinks that there's like metaphysical truth to it? One of the questions, one of the things I'm interested in is the extent to which
No, I
Plato may have had transcendent experiences as part of the Eleusinian mysteries. Is it Plu
I would love to know the answer to that because
mm,
obviously my main, hang up with Plato is that he's been overlooked as a mystic. So I,
mm,
I'm absolutely confident that there is, a whole mysterious piece to the whole philosophy, which, is undergirded by this obsession with numbers and musical numbers, which of course is Pythagorean. So it's clear to me that his, overarching philosophical belief is founded in esotericism. I- I'm I'm
mm,
I'm not sure the extent to which he had personal transcendent experiences because the way the literature comes to us is, twice removed. Like it's he didn't
yeah,
write anything that I would know that. But, that's the whole fun of reading the dialogues is when you look at them as a whole and you look at the questions as a whole and you look at the tone as a whole, it's obvious that his interest is in that dimension of human possibility. At the same
mm,
time, like as an academic, which I'm not anymore, but if I have to put that hat on for a second, all I can say for sure from reading the text is the whole thing is rhetorical. I think
mm,
it's very overread as a literal or fundamentalist, piece of literature, down to the politics. So like
mm,
once we get to the myths, I'm already, you know, totally persuaded that those are meant instructionally. So,
mm,
I mean, I don't know what the answer is to whether or not he really believed that or had that experience. And I also think the true Socratic answer is as long as it has a positive effect on the quality of your life, it's irrelevant.
mm,
But I mean, was Plato part of a religious or whatever, whatever
mm,
word is applicable there, you know, history, culture? Yes, of course. Is there
mm,
a pretty likely, scenario in which these things were discussed as real possibilities? Yeah, I would think
mm,
so.
mm.
Was he from his, ivory tower still believing that kind of stuff? I don't know. I kind
Right.
of I
Yeah.
kind of have my doubts.
Oh yeah. Say more about that. Say more about what it is in the text that.
I mean, it's kind of like, and I mean, I'm not an expert in modern religious literature either, but I can see the same conversation going on, which is, well, is it fundamentalism or is it didactic? Is it meant for us to explore it in our hearts, or are we meant to abide by this in a rule, in a rule kind of way? So various levels of religious and political people have very varying views on that. So I think it
Mm,
was probably there's a analogy that we could use to that as well.
right. Right. That makes sense.
I
Um.
mean, I guess I'm saying at a certain level of analysis, all philosophers and religious studies, experts are going to say we don't know.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think Plato would probably have to fall into that same category.
Yeah. Um.
But I have no proof of that.
And even for all our abiding ignorance on that question, it sounds like we can say with greater confidence that whatever the sort of like ontological or truth value of the myth of like its importance, it's the emphasis that it receives is fairly unquestionable.
See, that's true for all of Platonic philosophy. Like everybody wants to be ontological about Plato. And, I wanted to be too for a good solid decade because that's so exciting. Now we're going to talk about what is. Okay,
Mm,
but once you've done it for a while, what you find is it's empty. There's nothing actually there. So then it becomes a further question of, well, what's the point of elucidating a thought world to this extent with
mm.
no backing? You know, it's got to fall into a different, category of
Mm,
cognitive engagement, which is Plato's whole game.
mm, mm, mm,
I mean, that's the whole fun of it, When you're young, you find this text or you're younger and you're like, oh, this guy is going to tell me how things are the way they are and why. And then hundreds, thousands of pages later, you're still seeking this thing that he has described at incredible, in detail and in such magical imagery. I mean, the Republic is a story about the ontology of being and the levels of being. I mean, I think that's in book 7, it's like a long passage. Okay, so
mm,
and then at the end of it,
mm,
where's that whole thing?
mm, mm.
I mean, and that's the whole beauty of that myth too, is like these are all different prisms through which, as you say, the matter of life and death can be studied. One
Mm,
prism is ontological, another prism is mythological.
mm,
That's why Plato, I think, is so enduring, like I've heard that the Republic is studied more than the Bible. I don't know if
mm,
that's true, but it's very overstudied. And the question is, well, what's so enduring about it? Well, that's why it appeals to people on all,
mm.
all levels of the spectrum. Using mythology is opening that text up to art and to poetry and to all people of, humanitarian occupations, where if you had stopped at book 9, you would really limit the readership to a much more theoretical, analytical type.
Yeah, that's an interesting way. That's a really interesting way to put it. And what about
Those texts are holographic, like you could start them in different places and get different insights into
mm,
everything.
that's a nice way of putting it. What about like the structure of book 10 itself and like how Plato sets us up to receive the myth of Ur?
What do you mean? I don't remember.
Well, I mean, the myth of Ur opens, and Socrates says something like, "This isn't going to be like an Alcinous tale, like
Right.
the sort of tall tale, I guess is how a lot of people interpret that Odysseus told Alcinous. It's like saying that the myth or implying that the myth of Ur has some greater truth value than Homer. And I think the first part of book 10 is like
Yeah.
caught up with
Right.
finishing the critique of poetry.
Mhm.
Um, and I think then it's Glaucon says something like, okay, you've given us an argument for justice, like simplicator, just like justice without anything else. But now add in all of the other stuff that comes with justice.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that's the myth of Ur is sort of like Socrates' answer to that question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good summary, and that sounds accurate to me. I
I
mean,
think
so
that's right. I can't remember.
that is right. That is right. But the question is, why is it placed into that kind of couching? Why is it put in that Homeric criticism?
Yeah, yeah, that's part of it. And I think again, this is not a question we can resolve, but I'm wondering if there are textual or structural things that might point in this direction that like is the myth of Earth meant to have a certain force that other sorts of stories don't? And if so, what? I mean, it says that it's supposed to have a sort of a type of force that other stories don't. So,
Well, it does. I mean, that's why
mm,
we're talking about it, because it has a certain force that other stories don't have for the exact reason that you're writing a book about it. And I mean,
mm,
the thing about Homer is talk about a different view of life and death.
mm,
Like this is a very heroized version of death in Homer. It's a very primitive kind of death compared to the Platonic view of what's possible for a person. I mean,
mm,
Odysseus doesn't have the same potential, doesn't have the same possibility. And there's nothing wrong with that because obviously that's the context in which it was conceived. But
mm,
I'm very confident that Plato, he says it explicitly, Plato's view of the Republic is like a recast hero. Okay,
mm,
so if the recast hero is, a thoughtful, philosophical type of person, obviously they have a different view of death and life.
mm,
So, I mean, I do think that the whole of the Republic is meant to offer a new religion to a people who have been completely committed to
mm,
this, oral culture and this
mm,
heroized view of men.
mm,
Okay,
mm,
but so now we have a democratized view of what's possible for the human person, you
mm,
know, because now we've recast the whole project as
mm,
an inquiry instead of as an adventure or as a, war.
mm,
So
mm,
I think that the perspective you have on death is
mm,
completely redefined by redefining the whole,
mm,
game. And so
mm,
you're right to say that he's treading on very delicate territory because, it would be like us today saying, okay, well, the Bible was great for a couple thousand years, but now let's, all read A Course in Miracles. Like,
mm,
okay, that's a great
mm,
idea, but a lot of people are going to reject it, out
mm,
of hand.
mm,
Well, but that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what he did in that move to reassign us our cultural project.
mm, mm,
And
mm,
so the way that Homer was viewed in that, was very contentious, very delicate, and really reserved for only a certain, part of the population who is even willing to entertain the idea of replacing the encyclopedia of humanity, which is
mm,
what Homer was.
mm, mm,
So, I mean, he was well aware of how, you know, big a bomb this was dropping on civilization.
mm,
And by the way, that's part of why it's secretive, that's part of like people are going to ask me, and they did ask me in my, PhD interview, but why so much hiding? Why so much stuff to find? Well, this is why. I mean, it's not I find it a ridiculous question because to me the question is, well, why wouldn't you? I mean, what are you going to do? Just come out and
mm,
stand up and say, okay, everything that's been told to us is nonsense and this is all bullshit and we should reject, everything that we've been told is true about being
mm,
human.
mm,
Well, obviously he's not going to do that. That would be asking for to be ignored. So yes, it is hidden, it is couched, it is very subtle. And by the way, another thought I was having about the myth of Er that I think might be interesting for you is part of my argument was following that structural arc across a civic day, because
mm,
it's interesting that the reading time, falls in basically if you do the water clock analysis and the syllables per minute analysis, we come out to a civic day, 12 hours. Okay, but
mm,
we can place that day, which is very weird because Plato doesn't give too many calendar cues anywhere in the whole republic. So why is it that we know, approximately within 10 days what day this would be? So we do. I can't remember right now because it was a million years ago, but you can measure the astrological happenings of that day. So as you're moving into that myth of a reading, it's getting towards midnight. It's the darkest part of the
mm,
day. So it's like a
mm,
beautiful thing to think, we think about reading it like our book, laying in our bed, but we didn't have books back then. So it was a gathering of people probably listening to it, watching the
mm,
astrological happening. So it's kind of amazing to think about being born into that conversation in the, morning or in the light, and then it going through the happenings of the day into the death and darkness.
mm, mm,
It's real poetry.
mm, mm. And I think that fits with Plato's frequent inversions of the sort of Nequia structure, like, the philosophic assenses, as Earl calls them,
What did
like
you call them? The philosophical what?
philosophical ascents,
Oh, a sense. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
instead of going down into the underworld,
yeah,
it's
that's
an
right.
upward ascent, and that's dramatized. You're
Exactly.
getting like the point of light, or like the brightest part, as in the world of shadows, you're at the
Well,
at the
and
main.
as the descent, takes you out of the book, the ascent takes you back into the book. So
Mm,
as
mm,
you descend, and I mean, isn't that the philosophical meaning of considering death? Is as we go into it, we're reborn into some other, it's a very Buddhist, karmic,
mm,
dharmic
mm,
view of what's possible.
mm. Is your dissertation floating around on the internet, or could you send me a copy?
Oh, that's a great question. It is in some kind of archive because they put them all there, but I'm sure I have a copy on. I hope I have a copy somewhere. I regret now, when you graduate, they say for $80 we'll send you a bound version and you'll have your book. I was like, oh, I don't need that, but now I wish I had gotten it because people asked me for it. I don't wrote that book and I don't know where it is. But yes, I'm sure I can dig it up somewhere. Yes.
When were you in Oxford?
Gosh, when was I? I graduated in Good question. I can't even see it from here. I do not remember. I have my reading glasses on. I can't see that far. I don't remember. It's been a long time, obviously. 2007.
Oh, that's when you left Oxford?
Mhm.
Oh, that's
Gosh, that is a long time ago.
that is when I finished at Oxford as well.
Oh, wow, really? So we were
We would
there
have
at
been
the
there
same.
at the same time. Yeah,
What were you studying?
classics.
Oh, really? We didn't know
Uh,
each other? Maybe we did, and we just never bumped into each other.
I was an undergraduate.
That's a small department, though, so you would think we would cross paths somewhere. I mean, at least we did probably physically somewhere. And
Mm. Yeah, I was mostly had my tutorials in college and wasn't
what
in
college were you at?
at Balliol.
Oh, you were, but so that's where I was. Very strange.
You were at Balliol?
Yeah.
Really? Who were your tutors?
I had Richard Rutherford for most of it, and then I had what was his name? Oh gosh, you're really out of the loop when you can't remember the really famous guys. The guy who ended up coming after a while, West, not West. Gosh, what was his name? He was there with his wife. They became the deans of classics or whatever.
Hmm.
Very
Oh,
famous guy. Terrence Irwin, Perry Irwin.
oh,
Oh,
Terry.
so
Hmm.
it was Richard for a while, then Terry.
Huh.
I mean, then I started the PhD and then I just stopped. I didn't want to finish there. I did not
Yeah.
think it was going to go well. So then I took a break and then I finished at UNM, which was
Mm.
cool because they had a combined program, Eastern Western. So I got to study all of my favorite things.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
And then I had to, of course, learn Sanskrit after the fact, so that was not great.
Wow.
Yeah.
Uh, yes, I need to grapple with Eastern traditions on near-death experiences.
Well, by the way, that's one thing I was going to say is to me, the mystical, points directly to Eastern roots.
mm, mm,
Obviously, you know, there's some kind of reference here to Pythagorean beliefs, which somehow go even deeper into beliefs about rebirth and karma, and you know, they're Buddhist in some way.
mm, mm.
I mean,
Uh,
I don't know what they were back then, but that's how they are interpreted now.
yeah, yeah. Um, no, and I that's a good point. Like I don't know what if
I
there are
mean, and there is literature on this. I wish I had studied it. This is something I should have done. But there is literature on this cross
mm,
pollination with Eastern views.
mm, mm. Lots to do.
No. I mean, what's your profession now? Are you a professor?
No, I'm a journalist. I do
Oh,
journalism. I call it journalism of ideas. So I've profiled some.
journalism of ideas. Now that's a good idea.
It's good. It's good. I can do it mostly from my desk.
Yeah.
It fits in with the other responsibilities that I have in life. And so, I've done profiles of prominent thinkers, or done like written pieces about the internal conflict in the ACLU over freedom of speech in the wake of Charlottesville, but
I
use that as a jumping off point to talk about
get it.
the free speech ideas more broadly. So
Hey,
stuff like
speaking of free speech ideas and oligarchy, which
that.
I think is one of the topics that you're on. I mean, by the way, the myth of at its simplest, most reductionistic kind of level is a cry, an anti-oligarchy cry.
Mm,
If I recall correctly, you know,
mm,
the picking up of each life
mm,
it begs the question again and again, is, are material things important? Is the life of the king, of value? So,
mm,
I mean, it's very obvious what's going on there, but in a way, in a society where that's not obvious, it's a big move. And
mm,
the reason I'm thinking about it is because a lot of modern self-help literature will lead you in the same direction, which is, well, the real wealth is internal, but
mm,
we don't know that because we're so distracted by all the grasping at what's out here. And so the
mm,
myth of is really about that, isn't it? It's like, do you want
mm,
to pick up this life and become this person? Oh, that would entail this outcome. Or would it be better to be the unknown, labelless character?
mm, mm,
I mean, I'm just saying it's again this whole anti-establishment cry.
mm, mm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I hadn't considered that.
And by the way, that's why that myth is so. I would like to reread it now. I really wish I had read it to prepare for today, but
I
I
wish
could.
I had reread it too.
I was gonna say if we need to do that and come back to this conversation, we could because there's probably a part B to it, but when I'm thinking through the impacts that it has, I'm thinking, oh yeah, it has that very literal impact. It has that, circularity. It has that mythological posing of the iterative soul question. And so we're back to why use a myth? Well, that's why, because it invites every reader or
Mm,
every listener to self-examination at their own level, at their own entry point,
mm,
which is
mm,
exactly what the whole dialogues are about. This kind of
mm,
character, this kind of character, this kind of character. How can we cover all the kinds of characters and make everybody interested in philosophy together?
mm, mm, mm.
Which, by
Uh,
the way, culminates in community building. I mean, it's a really kind of obvious stacking of the deck towards a joy mentality.
mm. Yeah, no, that's a really lovely way of putting it. And something that I think people don't like tend to appreciate about philosophy, or close reading, or close reading in groups, the extent to which it makes us uncertain and vulnerable in front of one another, which
That's
has
why
a
everybody wants to take that book off. Let's just
mm.
take it off, then we don't have to deal with any of those. I mean, like, yeah, it's a fine idea, but really what people are doing is avoiding ambiguity. They're really just avoiding the void, which
Mm,
which is so indicative, right, of of it failing, actually.
mm,
Like that's the
mm,
whole joke of it is you want it whole if you want to do the project, that's a sign. But you want to take it apart if you want to avoid the project, that's a sign. So
mm.
I think it's got a very you know, diagnostic
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's
look
really
at
interesting.
it.
Yeah.
True, it's so much easier to go, oh, well, at 384B it says this, but at 481B it says this. So those things don't agree. So what are we going to do about that? That's a lot easier than, oh, here I am inside of this myth and what do I feel? What do I
Mm, mm,
experience?
mm, mm. I mean, I think there's like a role for
Yeah,
analytic philosophy. It's one of the ways into the aporia
sure.
is
I
is
agree.
through is through analysis. But um, yeah.
It's a way, but it's not the fastest way.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
I mean, I don't know that it's the way that Plato wanted it, I guess is the way I would put it.
Mm, mm, mm,
I think he was a holist, I think Plato was very much about the whole, the form,
mm, mm,
the soul as a totality.
mm,
And he knew that every time you take a perspective, you're missing a lot.
mm,
So
mm,
I mean, I don't know that there's something wrong with that if you know you're doing it, but ultimately, he was a very, very, very ultimate macro kind of visionary.
mm. Yeah, that's an interesting, like, where do you think, where do we get closest to his view on the nature of the soul? Like,
In the Republic.
maybe it's not in a single passage, it's in the totality of the Republic, but
I mean,
like,
I would actually venture to say it's the totality of the corpus because it's a beautiful view of so many different people and so many different positions and so
mm,
many, so it's a very macro view, that he had on life and the universe. And now we have the connection to mathematics and to, you know, music and all the relationships that has to cosmology. So, I mean, his view was incredibly weird. Like it was very much about seeing everything through the lens of the other thing, through the lens of the other thing, so that he could really say how everything is one. Like
mm,
that's the ultimate explanation of everything collapses into one thing ultimately.
mm,
So I
mm,
don't know, but where I would say you have the most complete view, except for at that ultimate level. But in terms of his assignment, it's in the Republic.
mm, mm,
To me, that's the I mean, and it's obvious because it's the one that everybody is attracted to and wants to read, but that's the core of if you want to live in the joy that I say is possible, here's the way to do it. It's an instructional book.
yeah, yeah. And what do you think about his views on, what do you take away from the Republic or the entire corpus about his views about the relationship between the soul and the body?
That's a good question I haven't thought about in a decade or so. I mean, that's complicated. You
Mm,
know, I don't have a stock answer, but ultimately we're back to, you know, his myths of generation, which are in the Timaeus, you know. I think there you have a pretty, I mean, and by the way, I don't know if you've explored the Timaeus at all, but here's a totally, you know, detailed, literal view of the genesis of humans and the opposite spectrum of the myth of Ur. So, you know, you he does give his explanation of how we became who we are and what's the meaning of that. You know,
mm, mm,
ultimately, though, in the end, the apology, all of the description of, you know, Socrates's own separation from his body, you know, lead us in the direction of he was much more interested in what we can do with
mm,
our souls, with our
mm,
SOUL.
mm, mm,
Obviously, did he see a correlation or a connection to, you know, what's needed from our physical life? Yeah, I mean, there's instructions on that too. I mean, actually, that's in the Republic, book 3, I think, you know, long
mm,
explanation of the role of gymnastics as a counterpart to the soul. But I mean,
mm,
ultimately, it's now we're back to the meaning of the myth of Mythover in terms of let go of the material, you know, let go of the, you know, obsession with stuff.
mm, mm,
He was
mm.
not very interested in any of that.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
was interested in it as it, you know, reflects on his society, which is obsessed with it. So
Mm,
he was trying to catch our attention. But like
mm,
ultimately, I don't see very much emphasis on the body. I see all the emphasis on the body as an extension of ourselves.
mm, mm.
But I mean, does it mean we weren't supposed to care about it? No, he was pretty clear and explicit about the care that we're supposed to put into it.
Yeah, yeah. And I've always found it striking that Socrates is so alpha in some ways.
Yeah.
Like he can drink anyone under the table without getting drunk. Like
He's
he
not, it's, you know what
can
though,
play war barefoot, like all of that.
you've mischaracterized it. He's actually the least alpha because none of that is machismo. None of that is, you know,
Mm,
willpower. Like alpha men tend to be, you know, faking it. Like his is really, I think now we're back to the comparison with the Eastern religions. Like it's really a
Aestheticism.
form of enlightenment. It's really a form of transcendence, like his way that he can drink anybody under the table or, you know, not sleep for days or whatever is just because he's so remote from life. He's so
Mm,
detached from anything. He doesn't give a shit. He doesn't give a shit what people say, what people think, what's going on the external. If he's
mm.
poor, if he's broke, if he's sick, if he's being condemned to death, he doesn't he's untouchable. I mean, he really has surrender. It's a point of surrender that, you know, we only hear about in terms of the saints. So
Mm,
that's an example, our earliest Western example of, you know, whatever that is, sainthood or whatever,
mm,
next level, you know, mindfulness. And
mm.
by the way, I mean, I think that's a very, and you could write a whole book on this, is just the, you know, neuroplasticity involved in detachment. I mean, he's our earliest example of this.
Yeah, that is going to be part of the book. It probably is like at least one book in its own right, but I'm hoping
Yeah,
to get like there is a bunch of interesting neuroscience of samadhi meditation and other
exactly.
things, the extent to which they connect to experiences.
I mean, that's him. Isn't
Mm,
it? Wasn't there a passage somewhere where he's in the war and he doesn't have boots and he's out in
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
snow? I mean, everybody else is running and he's walking. Like, you know, he just was not attached to life, so nothing was gonna bother
yeah.
him.
Mm, mm. Emily Wilson has a lovely reading of the
Yep.
end of Edo of like Socrates giving birth, going into labor and giving birth to himself. which I think, ties in with this like if if it looks like alpha, that's a misunderstanding of of what Socrates is all about. Um,
Yeah, the reason I say that is because alpha is very image based, but he's really not.
mm, mm,
Actually, not at all.
mm. And that, adds another interesting twist to the his relationship to the heroic tradition.
Exactly. Well, that's the whole thing about the, antithesis to Homer is like a recasting of what it means to be heroic.
Mm, mm,
And that's the hard sell, right? For Plato is now we're gonna make heroism internal. I mean,
mm.
like, how attractive is that? Like you really do have to put a reward on it somewhere,
Mm,
okay, this is
mm,
where the myths become important.
mm, mm. Um, okay, thank you so much.
My pleasure. So fun to get to talk about that. It's like one of those files that's way filed back in so
Mm.
it's always good to know it's there.
I could talk about it like literally all of the time. They're
I was
very,
gonna say, I don't, I mean, we're both busy and I'm sure this is an ongoing project. I will look over the myth because why not?
yeah,
And once I have it read, I'll let you know that I did. And if you want to talk more about the details, we could do that.
yeah, that would be great. I mean, I
I'm sure it's
don't know how much space I'm going to be able to devote to it, but it's like I want to do like
justice to it.
hours and hours and hours of work to get like the two perfect sentences.
I love that. That's beautiful. Cool. Well, if I can help or edit it or proofread
Yeah,
for
this
you,
has been incredibly helpful. I really appreciate it.
thanks for finding me. And if you see Earl or talk to him, tell him I send my best regards and hello to his family and himself.
Cool. I will do. Okay.
Okay. Well, great to meet you. Have a great afternoon, rest of the
Thank you
evening.
so much, Maya. Yeah. Good
Take care.
luck.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.